Some thoughts don't arrive with questions. They arrive with rhythm, not because they are true or urgent or needed, but because they've come before. Again and again in slightly different shapes, a sentence, a phrase, a quiet assumption. At first it sounds like nothing. It passes by without friction. It doesn't stay, not really, but then it returns, not as a demand, not as an idea to be tested, just as a familiar sequence of words that feels smoother the second time. It carries the weight of having been here already, and the more often it returns, the less attention it needs to slip inside. It becomes part of the internal weather, ambient, unnoticed, surrounding you. The mind does not raise alarms for the familiar. It settles into it. It lets it move through without resistance. And this, more than any argument or evidence, is how belief begins. Not in moments of clarity, but in quiet repetitions. Not with persuasion, but with presence. A repeated idea begins to sound like your own voice, not because you chose it, because you've heard it too many times to tell the difference. The brain loves the known. It is not a seeker of truth as much as it is a maker of patterns. Every repeated idea deepens a groove in your thinking, a path of least resistance. You begin to follow it without knowing you're walking. You begin to trust it, not because it has earned your trust, but because your thoughts no longer question its place. If something returns often enough, your mind files it under safe. Safe becomes familiar, and familiar becomes true. Not in a loud way, not in the way we imagine belief taking root, but in the quiet, frictionless way that water shapes stone. This is how the echo becomes a foundation. Repetition does not come knocking. It comes humming. It does not persuade. It paces. It doesn't fight to be heard. It waits until you are too tired to notice it entering, until you are busy or distracted or scrolling, until your conscious attention has softened. And then it settles in the space behind your thoughts, repeating just enough to begin blending in, until one day you don't hear it anymore. You speak it. You live by it. You call it instinct. But instincts, too, are shaped by exposure, by influence, by what was near you long enough to seem natural. The echo isn't just in your mind. It is in your language, your reactions, your tone, in the certainty with which you say things you've never actually examined. That's just how I am. That's just how things work. But trace it back. How do you know that? Where did that belief come from? Can you name its beginning? Or has it lived in you so long that you mistook it for origin? Most thoughts are not born. They are inherited, absorbed through headlines, overheard conversations, shared mantras, worn phrases. They enter through stories we didn't ask for, through systems we didn't design, through voices we mistook for our own. We don't notice the adoption, we only notice the ease, and ease becomes evidence. If a thought slides smoothly through the mind, we assume it must be right. But ease is not truth. Comfort is not clarity. A belief that feels good to think may only feel that way because it fits the groove that's already there. And repetition is generous. It doesn't care if what it repeats is helpful, or kind, or real. It doesn't filter by value. It only counts presence. The cruel thought repeated becomes a rule. The doubt repeated becomes a limitation. The judgment repeated becomes a mirror. We begin to live inside the most practiced phrases. I'm not good at this. They never really liked me. This always happens. These aren't insights. These are echoes. And the longer they repeat, the more invisible they become, until they shape how you walk into rooms, how you read silence, how you interpret kindness, until they become the script that runs beneath every decision, every hesitation, every no you never questioned. The illusion is subtle. It tells you this is how you've always thought. But there is a difference between what you are and what you've rehearsed. There is a difference between belief and repetition dressed as belief. You can feel it in the quiet moments, when a thought arrives too easily, when it speaks before you can ask who sent it. The voice sounds like yours, but whose words is it using? And it's not just individual. Cultures echo too. Societies repeat themselves, layering certainty over myth, normalcy over noise. Ideas become common not by being examined, but by being said by many. Shared belief reinforces itself through numbers, through volume, through visibility. What's seen the most becomes what's trusted, not because it was proven, because it was practiced. We confuse exposure with truth. We confuse common with correct. And in that confusion, we surrender thought for rhythm. We begin to believe what moves in familiar circles, even if it never had a center. There is no malice in this, only motion. The mind follows what has been paved, and repetition is the paving stone. Each return of a thought is another step toward unconscious agreement, another layer of dust over the origin, until nothing remains but the sense that this is how it has always been, that this thought must be true because it came back. But return is not proof. A shadow that follows you home every day is not the same as a friend. A sentence you've heard 1,000 times is not truer than one you've only heard once. It only feels that way because the echo is louder than the question. And questions are where truth begins. The echo doesn't need your permission to stay. It just needs you not to notice it anymore. It needs you to call it yours, to speak it aloud, to repeat it now in your own voice. But you can pause. You can listen. You can trace the edges of a thought and ask, did I choose this? Or did I just hear it too many times to imagine otherwise? There is no need to replace it. Just see it. Watch how it moves. Watch how it settles. Watch how it shifts when seen for what it is, a visitor who stayed long enough to be mistaken for family. And in that seeing, something shifts. Not violently, not suddenly, but clearly. The echo loses its weight, and you begin to hear your own voice again, not louder, just yours, just enough. The brain was never designed for silence. It fills the empty space before it can echo. It sees shapes in the clouds, faces in the bark, meaning in the flicker of a shadow. It strings dots together not to deceive you, but to protect you. Because in the beginning there were rustling leaves, and sometimes the rustle meant wind, and sometimes it meant danger. So the brain learned to lean toward meaning, even when meaning wasn't there. Better to flinch at nothing than to be too late. That was the trade. And now, long after the leaves stopped whispering threats, the mind still leans, still scans, still connects. It draws lines between coincidence and causality, between passing thoughts and imagined signs. A light flickers twice, and we wonder what it means. A stranger frowns, and we write an entire story around the wrinkle. A number repeats, and we feel the shiver of hidden design. The world becomes a gallery of almost patterns, noisy, chaotic, and full of soft rules we make to feel safe. The mind does not like static. It does not like randomness, so it paints over it, gently, constantly. It finds echoes where there are only repetitions. It finds messages where there are only marks. And in this endless search for shape, we begin to believe in things not because they are true, but because they are ordered. And ordered things feel true, even if they were arranged by accident. Even if the order lives only inside the frame we gave it, it's how we remember things, not as they happened, but in a way that feels clean. We rearrange the mess into a story, and then we believe the story more than the mess, but not every mess has meaning. Not every silence has subtext. Not every event is a symbol. Still, the brain looks. It sees a song lyric at just the right moment, and it whispers, "See, there it is again." It sees a name appear twice in one day, and it wonders if something is beginning. It doesn't matter if it's true, it matters that it fits. The pattern doesn't need evidence, it needs rhythm. Once the rhythm feels familiar, the pattern begins to shape belief, and belief begins to shape perception. You start to expect the repetition. You start to find what you are looking for, because the human mind would rather invent a pattern than accept randomness. And once a pattern is believed, every new moment becomes proof of it. You stub your toe and think, of course, it's that kind of day. You forget something and think, this always happens to me. A stranger is rude and you decide, people are just getting worse. These are not conclusions. These are constructions. The brain working quietly beneath awareness, linking one moment to the next with a thread that was never really there. But it feels there, and feeling is often enough. This is the strange comfort of imagined order. It turns noise into something nameable. It replaces the sharp edge of uncertainty with a soft loop of assumption. You believe in the pattern, and the pattern begins to believe in you. But not all patterns are harmless. Some become cages. Some become maps to places you no longer want to go. Some began as a guess and hardened into identity. And yet we follow them, because a wrong pattern often feels safer than no pattern at all. The unknown is harder to hold than the mistaken. So we tighten the thread. We follow the same signs. We repeat the same interpretations. And life becomes less about seeing and more about recognizing what we've already decided to see. But there is space between the dots. There is meaning in the mess, too, if we let it stay messy. If we stop polishing chaos into story. If we allow some things to be uncertain without needing to explain them. Because not everything is a sign. Not every thought is a signal. Some things just happen. Some things just are. And that, too, can be beautiful. The brain may always try to connect, but you can notice the connection being made. You can feel it reaching for shape and decide not to hold it so tightly. You can let the flicker be a flicker. Let the moment pass without naming it. Let the noise be noise, just for now. Because sometimes the only real pattern is the one we stop trying to find. There is a strange silence that follows certainty. Not the certainty you arrive at after long thought, but the kind you inherit. Ready-made, polished, wrapped in someone else's tone. It doesn't announce itself as borrowed. It sounds confident, practiced, clean. It wears a uniform, a suit, a smile that says, "Trust me." And so often we do. Not because we understand, not because we agree, but because we've been taught, quietly and for years, that confidence means competence, that volume equals truth, and that someone who looks sure must already know. The voice of authority doesn't need to explain. It needs only to exist in the right shape. A white coat, a podium, a polished bio. It speaks, and the room adjusts, not because the words are flawless, but because the speaker sounds like someone who has already done the thinking for us. And there is relief in that. There is comfort in the idea that someone else knows, that we don't have to, that we can rest inside their conviction like a warm blanket. But not all conviction is earned, not all authority is real, and even real authority can be wrong. Still, we obey the tone, not the truth. We follow the posture, not the proof. The mind is wired this way, not to question every instruction, but to reduce the weight of decision. It listens for signals of certainty and folds around them. Because questioning is costly, doubt requires effort. So, when a voice rises with enough confidence, enough symbols of power, enough quiet signals that say, "I belong above you," our minds often kneel without knowing they have. This doesn't make us weak, it makes us human. We are born into hierarchies. Long before we understand speech, we feel the power in a voice, the difference between a whisper and a command. And from that first division, the pattern begins. Some voices matter more. Some people are allowed to be right louder. Others are not, and we absorb that without needing to be told. Over time, authority becomes less about content and more about presence. We stop asking, "Is this true?" and start asking, "Does this sound like someone who would be right?" The criteria shift. Charisma becomes currency. Simplicity becomes seduction. And the more assured the tone, the less likely we are to notice the flaws in the message. This is how misinformation dresses itself in clarity, how ideology wears a crisp suit, how manipulation learns to smile and maintain eye contact. Authority is a performance. Sometimes it is earned, sometimes it is staged. But the effect on the listener is the same. The inner voice quiets. The internal question mark straightens itself into a period. You nod before you know why. You agree because the pause before disagreeing felt too long, because everyone else nodded first, because something in their voice made you feel like you'd be wrong to resist. And yet, even in disagreement, authority lingers. You may walk away unconvinced, but part of you still doubts your doubt, still wonders if maybe they knew something you didn't. That's how deep the performance reaches. It doesn't end with the moment. It echoes afterward in hesitation, in second-guessing, in the quiet erosion of your own certainty. You may replay the words later. You may find yourself quoting them, not because they were wise, but because they were delivered without hesitation. The echo isn't about accuracy, it's about impact. And some voices echo longer because we've been taught to believe they deserve the room. But who decides which voices matter? Who taught us to trust a certain tone, a certain vocabulary, a certain face? Who decided that calm equals correct, that passion equals instability, that the louder speaker wins? These are judgments woven into culture, passed down through systems, printed in textbooks, echoed in headlines. And over time we internalize the pattern. We grant some people the benefit of the doubt before they've earned it. We demand proof from others no matter how many times they've already shown it. And we do this without malice. We do this without noticing. We call it instinct. We call it a gut feeling. But often it's just the echo of authority living in us. There is no simple way to stop this. The mind does not like being adrift. It wants anchors. And authority offers them, neat, polished, weighty. So we cling to them, even when they drag us, even when they pull us into beliefs we didn't choose, habits we didn't question, hierarchies we didn't design. The voice speaks, and we listen, not always out of agreement, sometimes out of exhaustion, because thinking deeply is slow, because uncertainty is uncomfortable, because trust, once granted, makes life quieter. But quiet is not the same as peace. Silence is not the same as understanding, and obedience is not the same as truth. So what happens when we pause, not to reject, not to rebel, but just to listen differently? To ask, what does this voice gain by being right? To ask, who isn't speaking right now and why? To ask, would I believe this as quickly if it came from someone else? These questions don't have to break the spell, but they bend it just enough to let the light in, just enough to create space between the voice and your agreement, enough to let your own thinking return. It won't always feel comfortable. Doubt never does. But discomfort is not danger. It is the cost of awareness, and sometimes the voice of authority is right. Sometimes the suit, the podium, the polished tone, they come with knowledge, with kindness, with earned clarity. But that doesn't mean you owe them your mind. Agreement should never be automatic. Trust should never be unconscious, because the more often we trust without question, the quieter our questions become, until one day we forget we ever had the right to ask. And so, the next time you hear the voice that fills the room, confident, smooth, complete, let it speak, but also listen underneath it, not for what is said, but for what is missing, for the pressure behind the polish, for the need beneath the certainty, because every voice has a shape, and some shapes are made to soften your doubt, to hold it still while the words slip in. But your doubt belongs to you, and your questions are not noise. They are not interruptions. They are the beginning of your own voice returning, gently, slowly, without permission, only presence. There's a certain comfort in being surrounded by agreement, a soft permission to stop asking, a quiet relief that rises when many people seem to believe the same thing. Not because you understand it, not because it aligns with your deepest knowing, but because if so many others feel certain, surely there must be something there. The weight of numbers begins to substitute for clarity. The nodding of heads becomes its own kind of evidence. You stop looking outward for answers and start watching each other. This is not weakness, it is instinct. It is the oldest kind of safety. Move with the herd, stay where the others stand, follow the eyes that are already looking. The crowd becomes a compass, even if no one in it is holding a map. And slowly, silently, the idea that the group must know something you don't becomes easier to believe than the possibility that no one knows at all. You begin to feel the shape of belonging in the way you hold your thoughts. You measure your opinions not by their strength, but by how smoothly they fit into the room. You edit before you speak. You hesitate before you doubt, because doubt is heavier when you carry it alone, and belief is lighter when it's passed between many hands. So we pass it, we share it, we repeat what we've heard others say, not out of certainty, but out of the need to stay connected, a need to avoid the dissonance of being the only one who sees it differently. And even when the belief is thin, stretched over contradictions and questions, it often survives because it is wrapped in the warmth of consensus, because being right alone feels colder than being wrong together. This is how the illusion grows, not from one loud voice, but from many quiet ones echoing each other, a chorus of partial convictions, reinforcing and reflecting. The repetition becomes its own proof. You hear something twice, 3 times, 10 times, and start to forget where it began. You start to believe it not because you explored it, but because you overheard it enough to absorb it. The more often an idea appears, the more solid it becomes, not because it stands on facts, but because it stands on presence, and presence begins to resemble truth. But what happens when everyone believes something that no one truly believes? When people say what they think they're supposed to say, and others nod thinking the same? When we mistake silence for agreement and politeness for certainty? This is how the crowd becomes a mirror, reflecting reflections, never stopping to ask what the first image was. It loops endlessly until the belief sustains itself through nothing but the fear of standing apart. No one wants to be the first to say, "I'm not sure," because uncertainty sounds like weakness when spoken alone, and the crowd is allergic to weakness. It wants clarity, even if that clarity is hollow. So we play along. We smile when the others smile. We agree in vague terms. We repeat ideas we haven't tested, not because we've chosen them, but because we're tired of holding the weight of standing out. And in that exhaustion, the illusion becomes real. The group believes in its belief, and that belief becomes power. But power doesn't require truth. It only requires momentum. And once a belief has momentum, it can roll over questions like stones. It can turn doubt into defiance. It can turn curiosity into risk. And we begin to treat consensus as correctness, as if truth were something you could measure by volume. Yet there's a hollow sound inside every unexamined agreement, a subtle tension, a knowing you don't speak, the pause before you nod, the brief flicker of discomfort when you echo something that doesn't quite fit. That flicker matters. It's not always a sign to shout or disrupt. Sometimes it's just a signal that you are still there, beneath the layers of assumed agreement, beneath the shared phrases and careful smiles. There is nothing wrong with community, nothing wrong with shared belief. But shared belief is not a guarantee of truth. It is only a starting point. A question: do I believe this because I've thought it through, or because everyone else seems to? Would I still believe this if I were alone? Would I still say this if no one nodded back? The crowd is not unkind. It is just afraid of its own silence. It fills the air with agreement so no one has to feel the weight of not knowing. But not knowing is not failure. It is the beginning of thinking. It is the beginning of listening. And the beginning of listening is the beginning of seeing differently. Sometimes you don't have to leave the crowd. You only have to pause inside it, to feel your own weight apart from its rhythm, to let your doubt breathe for just a moment longer, to hear your voice, even if it doesn't rise above the rest, because the truth isn't always loud, and the crowd isn't always wrong, but neither is always right. And belief, real belief, should never arrive just because it came with applause. There is a strange weight in prediction, not the kind that looks outward to forecast the weather or calculate risk or guess the ending of a story, but the kind that quietly rewrites reality before it happens. The kind that sits inside your chest and decides, without permission, how things will probably go. You don't always notice it. It doesn't need your attention. It just settles, shapes your posture, tilts your interpretation, adjusts the color of your day before it even begins. And slowly, without asking, you begin to move in ways that fulfill it. You expect failure, so you prepare for it. You expect silence, so you speak a little less. You expect disappointment, so you dull your excitement before it has a chance to rise. Not out of logic, not out of evidence, but out of memory, habit, and repetition. And as you brace, the world obliges, not because it is cruel, but because you met it halfway. Expectation is not passive. It pulls, it edits, it makes room for the outcome you're already prepared to meet. You walk into the room believing they won't see you, so you shrink before you speak. You assume your effort won't matter, so you give less of it. You predict they won't care, so you avoid the edge of honesty that might have changed everything. And when things unfold in the shape you expected, you call it truth. But sometimes it was you, quietly, invisibly, setting the stage for the very story you feared, the prophecy that wrote itself with your help, the closed door you approached without knocking. We do this more than we know. Expectation is the script beneath the script, the thought before the thought. It doesn't need to be dramatic. Most of the time, it's not. It's subtle. It lives in pauses, in how much of yourself you offer, in how many questions you ask before deciding what the answer must be. And over time, those small decisions accumulate. They become the shape of who you think you are. I've always been like this, you say, but look closely. How much of that self was built by outcomes you quietly rehearsed before they happened? Sometimes we are not reacting to reality. We are reacting to a version of it we rehearsed 1,000 times in our heads. And then, with each rehearsal, we bend our choices to match it. It's not that the world becomes what we expect. It's that we meet the world in a way that fulfills our expectation. It becomes harder to distinguish belief from prediction and prediction from fact, because the loop closes in on itself. I expect this. I behave like this. This happens. I was right. But what if you weren't seeing what was inevitable, just what you prepared for? This is the invisible architecture of the self-fulfilling prophecy. Not magic, not destiny, just expectation, dressed in cause and effect. We think of belief as something passive, an opinion sitting in the background. But belief walks ahead of us. It clears the path. It points the light. And when the light is pointed only at certain outcomes, we miss everything else. You expect rejection, so you miss warmth. You expect chaos, so you overlook peace. You expect to fail, so you forget to notice when you don't. And slowly, your expectations begin to form the walls of what's possible. But expectation doesn't just shape outcomes, it shapes perception. Two people can see the same moment and walk away with different truths. Not because one is blind, but because each was looking for something different. We see what we're trained to notice. We interpret what we already believe. The mind doesn't just record, it filters. And the filter is built from old stories, old fears, old conclusions that once protected us, but now quietly limit us. Expectation becomes a kind of armor, thin, familiar, heavy, and beneath it a part of you stops reaching, not because it can't, but because it learned not to bother. Even hope can become a trap if it's built only on past disappointments. I won't expect too much, you say, as if lowering your gaze is the same as safety. But that's not protection. That's preemptive surrender. That's the mind trying to dull a pain before it arrives, without realizing it's giving that pain the space it needs to grow. we soften our own joy, we blur our own potential, and then we call it realism. But not all realism is real. Some of it is just fear, wearing the mask of experience. Some of it is just expectation, hardened by repetition. And when that happens, you don't just expect the worst. You prepare for it. You become it. Not out of failure, but out of habit. You shrink to fit a future you haven't even reached yet. But expectation is not fate. It is not prophecy. It is not law. It is a mirror, one that reflects not just what might come, but how you approach it. And mirrors can be turned. Light can fall differently. You can begin to notice when you are scripting the world before it arrives. You can ask, quietly, curiously, what else might be possible if I stopped bracing? If I walked into the moment without finishing its ending before it began? This is not about delusion. It is not about denying difficulty. It is about recognizing how softly the mind builds its own reality, how gently it adjusts the frame until the picture matches the story it expects, and how often, when we look again, there was more there than we first allowed ourselves to see. Expectation bends perception. Perception bends reality. And slowly, what you expect, you become. Memory pretends to be a recording, but it is more like a sketch drawn in fog. Soft at the edges, shifting every time you touch it. You don't remember what happened. You remember the last time you remembered it. Each recollection is a quiet edit, a retelling that gently overwrites the version before. Not with malice, not with invention, but with the slow erosion of certainty. And the mind, eager to resolve the blur, fills the gaps. It patches silence with story. It replaces what was lost with what makes sense. Over time, what makes sense becomes what must have been, and so memory becomes less about the past and more about the story we need it to be. Not because we want to lie to ourselves, but because the truth is too vast, too messy, too unstable to hold in its original form. So we smooth it out. Round the edges, sharpen the parts that support who we believe we are, and fade the rest into shadow. You don't mean to misremember. You just remember with a mind that needs coherence. A mind that doesn't store experience like data, but like narrative. A mind that reorders time to preserve meaning. That replaces confusion with clarity. That turns contradictions into clean lines, and what survives is not the event itself, but the interpretation, the feeling, the shape the moment took when it was folded into you. The photo album in your head does not contain reality. It contains stories, and the longer those stories live in you, the harder they become to question, because you've built things on top of them. Ideas, opinions, identity. To question the memory is to question the self that formed around it. And so we don't, or at least not often. We say, I remember it clearly, and we believe it. But clarity is not the same as accuracy. A vivid memory is not a true one. It is simply one we've rehearsed more, recalled more, told more. Belief sharpens the image. Emotion burns it in, but repetition is what seals it. And sometimes what we remember most clearly is the part we most wanted to be true. The version that made sense, the version that gave closure, or power, or safety, or distance. The mind also edits to survive. Some memories are too heavy to carry in their original form. So we adjust. We forget the details that hurt too much. We change the sequence. We recast the villain. We tell ourselves we didn't care that much, that we saw it coming. that we would do it differently now. Maybe we would, but the memory isn't just about what happened, it's about what we can live with. And so memory becomes a negotiation between truth and comfort, between what was and what is still echoing inside. There are also memories we inherit, stories told enough times that they become ours. You always loved this. You were such a shy child. You've never been good with people. Phrases handed down like family heirlooms, polished by repetition until they shine with the illusion of fact. But these are not memories. They are scripts. Scripts we begin to perform. We become the stories others told about us. And over time, we confuse that performance for personality. We say, "That's just who I've always been." But identity is not a fossil. It's a fluid. And memory is the container that keeps changing shape. Even shared memories diverge. You were there. They were there. But what each of you took away may live in completely different worlds. The conversation you replay every week may not exist at all in someone else's mind. Not because they've forgotten, but because they never remembered it the way you did. Memory is not collective. It is private, personal. A lens built from emotion, timing, belief. A mirror that bends with each glance. And the more important the memory feels, the more likely it is to shift. Not into lies, but into versions, drafts of truth. And yet, we trust it. We trust it because it feels internal, because it feels lived, because no one else was inside our head when it happened. But even your own mind cannot replay the moment exactly. The neurons change. The connections shift. You are not the same person remembering as you were experiencing. And so the act of remembering is not passive. It is creation. Every memory is a painting made from pieces, some real, some guessed, some borrowed, some imagined. So, what can we trust, if not memory, not certainty, not precision, but maybe something softer, the feeling that remains when we stop clinging to the image, the honesty that emerges when we admit we don't know exactly how it happened, only how it felt, only what we carried forward. Because that, too, is a kind of truth, not perfect, not fixed, but real in its own shifting way. To live is to rewrite, to change with the telling, to reshape the past each time it returns. And that doesn't make the memory meaningless, it makes it human. You are not a record, you are a river. And memory is just one of the currents that carries you forward. Never the same water, never the same shape, but always moving, always yours. There is a stage inside your mind, small but relentless, where every thought is a performer and every feeling waits for its cue. You are not always aware of the script being followed. You didn't write it all, much of it was handed to you, but the spotlight is yours. Where it lands, what it touches, how long it stays, and what the light finds, the mind believes. The moment a thought stands in that glow, it begins to feel important, more true, more real, not because it is, but because attention is a magnifier, a truth stretched across the frame. And what falls outside that frame begins to fade, not because it ceased to exist, but because it slipped beyond what was seen. The rest of the stage stays in shadow, holding the facts you forgot to consider, the people you didn't ask, the evidence that didn't fit the plot. And so you begin to live inside a narrow beam of light, mistaking the visible for the whole. The stories you tell yourself are not lies. They are arrangements of memory, of emotion, of emphasis. And what gets repeated begins to feel inevitable. The version of you who always falls short, the version who always has to be strong, the version who ruins things just before they get good. Each one steps into the light again and again until it no longer feels like performance. It feels like identity. You forget who wrote the role. You forget that you can exit the scene. Because the longer the spotlight stays on a thought, the more it carves itself into you. You replay the same moment, the same insult, the same decision you wish you could take back. You revisit it until it becomes architecture, something solid, something structural. But not all that is repeated should be permanent. Not all that returns deserves the stage. There is also the distortion of drama. What's unusual demands more space. What shocks, what stings, what wounds, these rise in the spotlight because they burn brighter. They demand attention. They override the subtle. The ordinary day, the silent kindness, the simple joy, these happen too quietly to make the script. So the mind remembers the noise and forgets the stillness. It highlights the moment you were embarrassed, not the years you were steady. It remembers the time they left, not the 1,000 mornings they stayed. This is not manipulation. It is a kind of survival. Pain feels urgent, urgency becomes memory, and memory becomes meaning. So you build your sense of self around what hurt loudest. You build your understanding of others around the one time they failed you. The spotlight lingers there, and the longer it lingers, the deeper the imprint becomes. Attention is not neutral. It bends what it touches. What you focus on grows, not in truth, but in shape. If you stare long enough at a flaw, it becomes the face. If you fixate on a doubt, it becomes the whole story. The world may not have changed, but your attention has, and where attention goes, reality follows. Not the external kind, the kind that shapes how you move, how you speak, what you expect. You begin to anticipate the narrative before it unfolds. You watch yourself from the corner of your mind, playing out a version of events you've already rehearsed. It becomes hard to act without performing, hard to feel without interpreting, hard to exist without editing the moment into a line that fits the role you've been cast in. But the stage isn't real, not entirely. It is a metaphor given power by repetition, and repetition, once seen clearly, can be interrupted. You can move the light. You can widen the frame. You can ask, what am I not seeing? What exists just outside the glow? The answer won't arrive all at once. The shadow won't vanish because you name it. But the question itself cracks the illusion. The performance pauses, and in that pause, something unfiltered can enter. You are not the character you've most rehearsed. You are not the worst thing you've ever believed about yourself. You are not the audience's opinion. You are not the spotlight. You are the one holding the light. And you can aim it differently, gently, patiently, toward the parts of the self that don't beg for attention, the parts that don't perform, the parts that have been waiting in the wings for you to notice they were there. Because beneath the stage, beneath the glow and the script and the applause and the doubt, there is something quieter, not a role, not a story, just presence, just awareness, just the simple fact of being that doesn't need to be explained to be real. And when the light lands there, on the part of you that isn't trying to prove anything, it doesn't flare up or take center. It just stays, unmoving, unimpressed, unafraid, and you remember for a moment that not everything has to be performed to be true. You do not always choose. You are not always deciding. There are choices, yes, but many are already shaped before you arrive. Not by fate, not by some distant hand pulling strings, but by the invisible scaffolding around every decision. The structure beneath the options, the shape of the frame itself, what is placed first, what is placed last, what is highlighted, what is hidden. These quiet details, unspoken, unquestioned, guide you far more than you realize. You think you are free when you click the box, choose the word, follow the path. But the path was drawn for you. And freedom in that moment is only the illusion of navigation inside someone else's design. This is not conspiracy, it is construction, a blueprint of influence, a layout of defaults, and it works best when it is not seen. The menu you are given does not include everything. Only what fits the model, the system, the logic of efficiency or profit or tradition. And you, moving through the options, feel empowered by the act of choosing. But the power was in the arrangement, in what was left out, in how the options were framed. This is the silent architect, the unseen influence behind the curtain. Not telling you what to think, just making it more likely. Not forcing your hand, just nudging it gently, silently over time. A question asked a certain way can reshape the answer. A sentence phrased to lead can change your conclusion. A word swapped, a number rounded, a default left checked. Small things. Harmless maybe, but across 1,000 decisions, the shape of your life begins to curve in a direction you did not design. And it feels like your own path, because each step was yours. But each step was placed where it was easiest to follow. And you didn't ask why it was there. You didn't see the hand that placed it. We trust structure. We trust what is built, what is given form. But not all structures are neutral. Not all forms are clean. A default is not just a starting point. It is a suggestion, dressed as normal. It says, "This is the way." And unless you are already paying attention, you follow. Not because you agree, because there is no friction. And humans are built to avoid friction. We call it intuition. We call it habit. But often it is only the residue of design, a choice made for you, just subtle enough to feel like your own. Even the way a truth is presented changes how true it feels. A fact inside a bold frame feels more urgent than the same fact in small print. A claim repeated enough times begins to sound like knowledge. An option placed at the top is selected more, even if it's no better than the one at the bottom. This is not because people are irrational. It is because people are responding to architecture. And architecture, once built, becomes invisible. It is the water the fish forgets to see. And when you are surrounded by invisible structures, it becomes hard to know where your will begins. You say, "I made the best choice I could." But who built the list you chose from? Who decided which questions you would never think to ask? Who placed the boundary that made everything outside of it seem impossible, ridiculous, irrelevant? These are not abstract concerns. They are the quiet frames that shape everything from how we vote, to how we shop, to how we understand ourselves. Even memory obeys architecture. The way an event is labeled, sequenced, presented, the narrative of it, shapes how it will be stored, recalled, felt. The architecture of a conversation. Who speaks first? Who sets the tone? Who defines the terms? Can shape not just the outcome but the beliefs formed around it. And the deeper you look, the more you find that most of your gut feelings are trained responses to the environments you've been handed. You learned what to trust, what to ignore, what to expect. Not always through explanation, but through design, through repetition, through the layout of reward and risk that was already waiting when you got here. But this is not the end of freedom. This is the beginning of seeing it clearly, because what has been built can be questioned, what has been assumed can be interrupted. The frame is not permanent, the menu is not the full list. The options you've been given are not the limits of what is possible. And the moment you begin to see the architecture, you begin to find the cracks. Not to escape the system entirely, but to breathe inside it, to say, I see what you're doing, and now I will choose, fully awake. The silent architect does not leave, it does not crumble overnight, but when it is named, it loses power, and when it is seen, it begins to bend. You still live inside systems, but you begin to walk differently. You begin to ask, what's missing from this choice? Who benefits from this structure? What am I not being asked to imagine? And even if the answer is unclear, the question is enough, because the question moves the light. And when the light moves, the walls show their seams, and what felt like the only way forward becomes just one hallway in a much larger house. The mind has a strange affection for the familiar, not because it is better, not because it is right, but because it is smooth. It slides in without resistance. It fits. And in a world that often feels jagged, what fits becomes sacred. A word you've heard before, a phrase repeated just enough, a face seen often, all begin to feel more true than their unfamiliar counterparts. Not because you examined them, not because you tested them, but because they asked less of you. And the brain, always negotiating between effort and ease, prefers what asks less. This is not laziness, it is survival. The familiar is easier to process, and ease feels like safety, and safety feels like correctness. If a sentence flows well, if it sounds like something you've heard before, the mind lowers its guard. It welcomes it in, and what is welcomed often enough stops being questioned. This is the fluency bias, when how easily something is processed becomes a stand-in for how true it feels. You think, this sounds right, but what you mean is, this feels easy to accept. So repetition becomes a kind of camouflage, a way for ideas to sneak past scrutiny. The more often you hear something, the more true it begins to feel, not through evidence, but through exposure. It echoes, it returns, and with each return it deepens its groove. This is how belief begins, not with clarity, but with rhythm. The chorus you've heard too many times to resist. The claim that rings familiar, not because you've confirmed it, but because the words have worn a path through your attention. You may not even remember where it started. A headline, a joke, a whisper said by someone you once admired. But it stuck, and now, years later, you repeat it as if it came from you. It feels internal, but it was planted. Not maliciously, not even intentionally, just often enough, just loudly enough, just long enough ago. And the mind, unable to trace its source, calls it memory. This is how myths survive, how misinformation spreads, how casual claims evolve into cultural truths. Not through logic, through repetition. If an idea is seen enough times, printed, posted, spoken, shared, it begins to wear the costume of truth. The costume becomes skin, and we stop asking who tailored it. We stop asking if it fits. The same thing happens with faces, with products, with names. What you recognize begins to feel safe. What you see more becomes what you want, not because it is better, just because it's nearby. This is the exposure effect. The billboard you drive past every morning becomes more trustworthy than the unknown voice with better information. The person you've seen on 100 screens becomes someone whose opinion feels legitimate, even if they've said nothing of depth. Familiarity becomes credibility. Presence becomes authority. And slowly, the world begins to look smaller, simpler, more certain, because you've stopped letting anything unfamiliar through the door. Even your own thoughts are filtered this way. The ones that return most often feel the most natural, but natural is not the same as chosen. A belief you've carried for years may not have been earned. It may have simply repeated itself enough to stop feeling foreign. And the alternative, the uncomfortable, the strange, the unfamiliar, never had a chance to make a case. Because unfamiliar thoughts feel harder to hold, harder to trust. They require more friction. And friction often gets mistaken for wrongness. But what if the unfamiliar is only unfamiliar? What if its strangeness is not a warning, but a doorway? What if difficulty is not the sign of error, but the cost of waking up? To notice this is not to discard everything you know. It is to look again, to ask, do I believe this because it's true, or because I've heard it enough times not to question it anymore? Do I trust this face, this phrase, this answer because it feels right, or because it arrived often enough to become mine? There is no shame in ease, but there is risk in confusing it for truth. The smoothest thought is not always the clearest. The most familiar story is not always the most honest, and the loudest belief is not always your own. You can still carry the familiar, but carry it with awareness. Hold it to the light. Watch how quickly it answers your questions. Too quickly, maybe, like it's rehearsed this before, like it's been waiting for you to ask, just so it can quiet you again. The mind wants comfort, but sometimes truth begins where comfort ends. Not with what feels known, but with what asks to be known. Even if it sounds strange, even if it takes more time, even if it doesn't fit. Not yet. There is a space between stimulus and response where something soft happens, quieter than reason, older than language. A feeling flickers, and before the mind begins to calculate, the body already knows how it wants things to go. Logic waits its turn, but feeling has already taken a seat. It doesn't explain itself. It doesn't need to. Emotion arrives like a compass, not asking for direction, but offering one. And once a path is felt, the thoughts fall in line, not to discover the truth, but to justify the feeling that was already there. This is not failure. This is architecture. The brain is built to conserve energy. It moves from what is felt to what is explained, not the other way around. The story you tell about what you believe is often built on the foundation of how you felt about it first. The words arrive later. The reasons are arranged like furniture in a room that was already drawn. And the more you believe the room was rationally chosen, the more invisible the design becomes. You say, I believe this because it's right, but if you could slow the process down, you might see it differently. You'd see the discomfort rising first, the flicker of offense, the curl of fear, the flash of familiarity. you'd see how the thought adjusted itself to preserve that feeling, how doubt was softened, how counterpoints were blurred, how logic was shaped not like a blade but like a cushion, pressed gently against the conclusion you already needed to reach. Emotion isn't loud all the time. It doesn't scream. Often it moves like gravity, constant, unfelt, unquestioned. It guides the weight of your attention. It determines which facts glow and which facts fade. It decides what you notice, what you trust, what you remember. And once a feeling is tied to a belief, pulling them apart becomes a kind of mourning. Because changing your mind doesn't just mean replacing one thought with another. It means letting go of a version of the world that made you feel safe, or proud, or good. This is why two people can see the same information and walk away more convinced of opposite truths. It's not because one of them is blind. It's because each person's feelings lean in different directions, and those leanings, those invisible angles, bend the data before it touches the surface. A sentence feels right because it matches the mood. A claim feels true because it speaks to something unresolved. We call it intuition, but often it is memory in disguise. Emotional residue that clings to new information, staining it in advance. Even the body joins in. A racing heart, a tightening jaw, a quiet pulling back. You think you're being logical, but your nervous system is already reacting. Your interpretation of a face, a tone, a silence, none of it begins in neutrality. It begins in your own history. The stories you've lived through, the wounds you've carried, the joys you're chasing. And from that palette, reality is painted again and again. The trouble is not that emotion distorts thought. The trouble is that we pretend it doesn't, that we imagine ourselves as clean processors of information, that we believe our beliefs are built only from facts, when in truth they are shaped by which facts made us feel something warm, something stable, something familiar enough not to threaten the foundation we've spent years standing on. And so we armor ourselves with reasons, unaware that they were chosen to protect the feeling, not the truth. We debate, not to discover, but to defend. We ask questions that are shaped like answers. We seek evidence that matches our expectations. We gather facts like firewood, not to light the unknown, but to keep the old warmth alive. But if you pause long enough, you can catch it. The sequence, feeling first, then the thought, then the reason, then the certainty. You can trace the shape of the logic back to its emotional root. And in that root, you'll find something tender, something that was trying to protect you, to stabilize the moment, to make sense of a world that rarely offers clarity. This awareness doesn't erase the feeling. It doesn't demand you discard every belief born in its shadow. It only asks that you see the order of things, that you know which part came first, that you hold your reasons gently, knowing they may be masks for something deeper, something older, something still unfolding. Because you are not a machine. You are not a calculator. You are a being shaped by waves, internal tides that rise and fall without asking permission. And in the space between one wave and the next, the mind writes its story. Not always true, not always fair, but always trying to make the water feel like land. And that's where belief begins, not in the clearest thought, but in the feeling that said, yes, before the thought had time to speak. Long before you had words for it, the world was already teaching you how to look. Not with your eyes, but with your expectations, with your instincts, with your quiet, invisible rules. Childhood doesn't ask for permission to write its lessons, it just does. It builds patterns in the background. It draws emotional maps. It teaches you what danger looks like, even if there's no danger at all. It teaches you who listens, who leaves, when to speak, when to stay small. These lessons weren't given with clarity. They were absorbed in silence, in glances, in timing, in the spaces between words. And though you grew up, those maps stayed. You learned new things. Yes, but much of what you call you was drawn before you knew you were being drawn. You look at the present and think you're responding to what's in front of you. But so often you're responding to a moment that already happened. A memory that shaped how your body reacts before your thoughts can catch up. Someone raises their voice and you flinch, not because of now, but because of then. Someone cancels and you feel abandoned, not because they meant to hurt you, but because absence has always sounded like rejection in your story. You find patterns where there might be none. You brace for endings before beginnings even settle. These aren't choices, they're echoes, echoes of who you had to be to survive a world that didn't explain itself. And the brain, brilliant and cautious, doesn't forget what kept you safe. It stores those early adaptations like sacred scripts. It whispers, "Stay quiet here. Don't trust this. Look away from that. They won't understand." It learned what love looked like, what punishment sounded like, what safety felt like, and now, even in moments that don't match the original story, it plays the same soundtrack. Not because it's trying to deceive you, but because it's trying to keep you alive. Familiar equals safe. Predictable equals manageable. Even if the prediction is pain, at least it's a pain you know how to hold. And so, you carry forward these inherited instincts, habits of thought, reflexes of interpretation. You may call it intuition. You may call it common sense. But if you look closely, many of the truths you believe most deeply are simply the ones you learned earliest, not tested, not chosen, just repeated until they became law. Some of these laws are quiet. Don't ask for too much. People will leave if you're too honest. You have to be useful to be loved. You didn't write these laws, but you've been living by them. And the longer they go unspoken, the more invisible they become. This is not about blame. This is about tracing the shape of what moves through you, because not all of what you carry is yours. Some of it was handed down, shaped by culture, by family, by systems that wrapped themselves around your earliest years. You inherited more than your name. You inherited belief structures, fear strategies, emotional blueprints passed from one generation to the next, often unspoken. What your parents feared, you absorbed. What they praised, you reached for. What they avoided, you avoided too. And what they didn't know how to heal became the wound you call your own. But what is inherited can be examined. It can be softened. You do not have to break from your past to grow beyond it. You only have to look at it with eyes that know the difference between origin and ownership. A thought you've had since you were 6 isn't truer just because it arrived first. A belief that's been with you the longest isn't sacred. It's familiar. And familiarity, as you've seen before, is not the same as truth. You begin to notice the patterns, how certain emotions arrive too quickly, how you read disappointment into silence, how you brace for blame before it's offered. And instead of asking what's wrong with me, you begin to ask, where did this begin? You follow the thread back, gently, without judgment. You see the child who needed to stay safe, the teenager who made herself small, the adult who still carries the shield. And in that seeing, something shifts. The pattern doesn't vanish, but it loses its power to name you. Because who you were does not have to write every line of what you become. It may still write the first draft. But you can revise it. You can step into a moment and notice that the fear is old, that the reaction is recycled, that the expectation belongs to a version of you that was just trying to survive. And you can say, thank you, and then you can choose something different. Slowly, gently, without rushing the process. You will still feel the pull of the old stories. You will still hear the voice that says, this is how it's always been. But that voice is not the future. It is the echo of survival, not the sound of who you are becoming. And with time, the volume dims. Not because you've erased the past, but because you've stepped outside its shadow. And what you begin to see, truly see, is that even though you did not choose your beginning, you are choosing now. The truths you carry aren't always the biggest ones. They aren't always the ones that stretch across the sky, demanding you rearrange your life in their presence. Sometimes the truths that survive are the ones that fit, the ones that can be folded small enough to hide inside your daily rituals, the ones that match your hopes just enough to feel gentle. Belief is not always a quest for what's real. Often it's a negotiation between what's true and what's livable. The ideas you hold on to aren't always chosen for accuracy. They're chosen for comfort, for simplicity, for how quietly they let you sleep at night. We believe what feels good, and then we find reasons to call it rational. We call it logic. We call it perspective. But underneath the reasoning, there is often just a feeling. This thought makes things easier, and ease, as always, becomes a stand-in for truth. You want to believe the best of someone because it lets you stay. You want to believe the worst of someone because it lets you leave. You want to believe you're not ready so you don't have to risk anything. You want to believe it's too late so you can stop trying. These are not observations. They are permissions. Emotions looking for ideas to carry them. And once a belief is found that supports the feeling, the search ends. But sometimes the beliefs we adopt for comfort become cages. At first, they shrink the world just enough to make it manageable. Later, they shrink you. You begin to repeat the same story about what you can't do, what people are like, what always happens. And each time it's told, the edges harden. The idea becomes an identity. The preference becomes a law. And the truth that once fit inside your pocket now fits so tightly around your life that there's no room left for anything else. This is how motivated reasoning works. You begin with a feeling, fear, hope, shame, desire, and build the belief around it. You look for evidence that confirms what you need to believe, not because you're dishonest, but because you're human. The brain protects what you value by shaping what you notice. You don't see everything. You see what fits the frame. And the frame was made not of facts, but of feelings. It happens in the smallest ways. You ignore the red flag because it contradicts the fantasy. You dismiss the compliment because it doesn't match your shame. You find a flaw in the article that challenges your worldview. not because it's wrong, but because letting it be right would make you feel exposed. The truth in these moments isn't rejected directly. It's trimmed, adjusted, deferred, shaped into something more acceptable, something that doesn't require a reckoning. And that's the danger of convenient truths. They arrive without disruption. They sit down quietly beside you. They ask for nothing but agreement. And in giving it, you begin to live in a version of the world that reflects what you already want to feel. Desire doesn't always speak loudly. It doesn't always look like craving. Sometimes it looks like certainty. You want to be right, so you defend the idea that flatters you. You want to belong, so you adopt the belief that keeps you included. You want to feel less guilt, so you reshape the story in your favor. You want to stay safe, so you believe the danger is too great to move. These are not lies. They're half-truths worn down until they pass for whole. And the more often you repeat them, the more real they feel. The brain rewards consistency. The nervous system rewards relief. And when an idea gives you both, it begins to live in you like a truth. But truth isn't always the thought that feels best. Sometimes it's the thought that stays, even when it's inconvenient, even when it costs you, even when it changes you. You can feel the difference. The convenient truth feels like a blanket pulled over a draft. It soothes, it shields. The deeper truth feels like a window cracked open. It lets in air, but also discomfort. And yet, it's the window that frees you, that widens the room, that makes it possible to breathe again. But there's no shame in the blanket. There's no guilt in wanting ease. You do not have to rip the illusion away all at once. Awareness is enough to see when your belief is bending toward what you hope is true. To notice when you're choosing the softer version of reality not because it's more accurate, but because it hurts less. To admit that some truths are still too sharp to hold, and that's okay. You don't have to carry every truth all at once, but you can start to empty your pockets. Slowly, one belief at a time, lay it in the light and ask, does this serve me or just soothe me? Is this a fact or a feeling dressed as one? Have I examined this or just inherited it because it made things simpler? And when you find a belief that no longer fits, not because it's wrong, but because you've outgrown the version of yourself that needed it, you can let it go. Gently, without judgment, with gratitude even, because it helped you survive. But survival is not the same as living, and the truths that once fit in your pocket do not have to define the shape of your life forever. You can choose truths that stretch you, that challenge you, that hold space for both comfort and contradiction. Not because they are easy, but because they are honest. And honest truths do not always fit, but they leave room for you to grow. You like to believe you are thinking, that your mind is a clean engine humming toward truth, sorting fact from fiction with sharp edges and calm hands. But most of the time, what you call thinking is something else. It is remembering. It is filtering. It is defending. It is rehearsing conclusions you've already drawn, now dressed in new language to make them feel earned. The mind, when left to itself, does not seek truth. It seeks comfort through consistency. It moves toward what feels familiar, what feels right, what feels like it belongs. This is not logic, it is fluency. And fluency, repeated often enough, becomes indistinguishable from reason. You build arguments not from scratch, but from parts already lying around. The last article you skimmed, the last voice you trusted, the last conclusion that helped you feel intact. You pick what works, you frame it well, you call it rational. But deep down, you know most of your thinking did not begin with a question. It began with a need, the need to feel right, to feel in control, to make sense of something that scared you. The mind is a master of disguise. It can turn intuition into logic, emotion into evidence, a hunch into a hardened belief. This is what cognitive ease looks like, a thought that slips in without friction, then starts to build a home. Not because it is carefully examined, but because it feels good to keep. You stop asking, "Is this true?" and start asking, "Does this make sense to me?" But makes sense is not a test of truth. It's a measure of fit, a measure of how neatly the idea clicks into your existing patterns, how easily it reinforces what you already believe. And so your logic becomes a mirror. It reflects you back to yourself. It strengthens the shape you already inhabit. It confirms what your emotions want to be confirmed. Even the language of rationality can be used to guard the irrational. You call someone emotional to dismiss their point. You call yourself objective to end the debate. But objectivity is rare. It requires distance, time, discomfort. And most of the time, we do not sit still long enough to reach it. Instead, we take shortcuts, heuristics, fast judgments dressed as decisions. These mental shortcuts are not flaws. They are features of a system trying to keep up, a system built to survive, not to philosophize. But survival doesn't always need truth. It needs speed. It needs clarity, even if that clarity is false. So you replace complex problems with simpler ones. You answer the question you wish had been asked. You mistake the easy solution for the correct one. And then you move on. This is substitution. This is how the mind keeps functioning, by reducing reality into smaller, more manageable parts. You feel clever. You feel sure. But what you're often feeling is relief, not reason. You are not broken for doing this. You are built this way. Rational thought is the exception, not the default. And yet, the myth persists, that we are thinkers first, that feeling comes second. That bias is a glitch, but bias is the rule. It lives in the design. Every decision is nudged by it. Every memory is edited by it. Every conclusion is filtered through it. Even awareness of bias is not protection from it. You do not step outside your mind to evaluate your thinking. You use the same flawed system to test itself, a mirror trying to inspect its own reflection. And still, you try, because trying matters, because even if perfect logic is impossible, better thinking is not. Better thinking begins with humility, with the pause that admits, "I might be wrong," with the quiet voice that says, "This feels right, but feeling isn't proof," with the willingness to ask yourself, not just once, but often, "What am I not seeing? What part of me wants this to be true? What would I believe if I wasn't afraid to change my mind?" The myth of rational thought doesn't need to be destroyed. It needs to be softened, held gently like a tool, not a truth. You can still use your mind. You can still reach for logic. But you no longer have to pretend that every thought you build is clean. You can see the scaffolding. You can name the shortcuts. You can admit when an idea is comfortable but not examined. And in that naming, you begin to loosen the illusion that your mind is a courtroom instead of a stage. that your thoughts are weighed on scales instead of edited behind curtains. That belief emerges from clarity instead of convenience. The illusion fades, not into despair, but into possibility, because when you know that your thoughts are stitched from feelings, from patterns, from needs, you gain something rare. You gain the power to choose which parts to keep and which ones to unthread. Slowly, honestly, not to reach perfect logic, but to become less certain and more awake. Not all lies are told out loud. Some settle quietly into the folds of who you are. They don't arrive with conflict, they arrive with comfort. They do not demand belief, they suggest it. And suggestion, when repeated with enough softness, becomes architecture. A story here, a justification there, a silence left unchallenged long enough to be mistaken for truth. You don't remember when it began, only that it stayed. And now it lives in the way you introduce yourself, in the way you avoid certain questions, in the way you defend parts of yourself you never truly examined. These lies don't sound like lies anymore. They sound like personality. You tell yourself you're not angry, that you've moved on, that it didn't really affect you. You tell yourself they didn't mean to hurt you, that you would have done the same, that you were probably overreacting. You tell yourself it's fine, it's always been fine. And maybe you even believe it. But belief built to protect is not the same as belief built on truth, and the deeper it hides, the more likely it becomes indistinguishable from you. These lies aren't malicious, they're shields, tiny rephrasings meant to make the unbearable bearable. The unfair seem fair, the out of control feel chosen, and the more often you repeat them, the more permanent they feel. This is the self-serving bias, where the story is always slightly rewritten to keep you in the light. Not because you're dishonest, because you're fragile, because shame is heavy, and regret has sharp corners. So you soften the edges, you forget the parts that don't support your image. You magnify the parts that do, not to deceive others, but to stay whole. And then there's the just world hypothesis, the need to believe that life has rules, that good things happen to good people, that effort is always rewarded, that pain is always deserved. Because if you accept that the world is chaotic, you have to accept that anything can happen, that you might suffer for no reason, that the people you love might never be repaid for their kindness, that cruelty can succeed. So instead, you build a logic, a story, something that fits, something that turns misfortune into moral lessons, injustice into fate. It doesn't hold under pressure, but it holds you, and so you keep it. You lie to survive. You lie to stay. You lie to avoid the cost of confrontation, not with others, but with yourself. You tell yourself you're over it, that you don't need closure, that forgiveness happened, that you're not still waiting for them to say what they never said. You build altars to these lies. You decorate them with phrases like, "It's for the best," and "everything happens for a reason." But some things don't have a reason. Some things just happen. And pretending they don't isn't healing, it's management. There's also moral licensing, the lie that goodness in one area absolves failure in another. You tell yourself you're kind, so your cruelty must have been justified. You tell yourself you're fair, so your judgment must be right. You excuse moments of harm because they don't match the image you've cultivated, and so the image wins. The reality is edited, and slowly, piece by piece, The truth is replaced by what you can live with. But you can only carry so many of these lies before they begin to stiffen your life. They make you predictable. They make you defensive. They keep you walking in circles, reacting to patterns you pretend not to see. You find yourself snapping without knowing why, feeling unseen without knowing what you needed. These are the signs, not of failure, but of fracture, the gap between what you know and what you let yourself admit. Yet even in this, there is no shame. There is only the beginning of awareness, because the lies you live by were not chosen lightly. They were chosen when you had no other way, when truth would have cracked something you weren't ready to rebuild. And so you told yourself what you needed to hear. You survived. And survival is sacred, but it is not the same as living. At some point, the story that saved you becomes the story that confines you. So what happens when you stop defending it? Not all at once, not violently, but with softness, with curiosity, with the question, what part of this is real and what part is just rehearsed? What do I say because it's true? And what do I say because it sounds good when I say it? What do I believe because it brings me peace? And what do I need to believe, even if it doesn't? You may not like the answers. They may sting. They may shift the floor beneath you, but they will make space. Space for truth, space for complexity, space for contradictions that don't collapse you. Because the goal isn't to be right all the time. The goal is to be whole. And wholeness requires truth, even when it's inconvenient, even when it changes the story, even when it leaves you holding a version of yourself that you used to keep hidden. You are not your defense. You are not your image. You are not the story you tell at parties. You are something softer, something deeper. And the lies, even the useful ones, even the pretty ones, can be put down, not because they're evil, but because they're heavy, and you've carried them long enough. Let them go, and in the silence that follows, listen. You may find that the truth, however small, however strange, is lighter than you feared, and strong enough to stand on. You are being shaped, not loudly, not cruelly, but constantly. Each time you look, something looks back, not with eyes, but with design, with systems tuned not to teach you, but to reflect you. You scroll, and the scroll learns. You click, and the click records. The more you engage, the more it knows, and the more it knows, the more it shows. Not what is true, not what is whole, but what is likely to hold your attention just long enough to feed the loop. This is not corruption. This is structure. An invisible net that catches your preferences and hands them back to you, polished into certainty. What you see again and again begins to feel like the whole story. Not because it is, but because it's all that's visible. The posts you read, the voices you follow, the opinions that echo until contradiction feels like intrusion. These patterns become normal, not because they reflect the world, but because they reflect your world, the one built around you by silent math, by algorithms that don't ask what's true. They ask what works. And what works is often what feels familiar, what feels urgent, what feels like it belongs in your mental orbit. Over time, this repetition becomes a lens, and the lens begins to harden. You start to mistake visibility for reality. The beliefs you encounter most often begin to feel more valid. The stories that match your emotions begin to override the ones that challenge them. You say, "This must be how things are," but what you really mean is, this is what I keep seeing. And what you keep seeing is what the system thinks will keep you seeing more. A quiet loop, a soft narrowing, not imposed but accepted. You forget how many choices were made before you arrived, what post was promoted, what video was suggested, what image was cropped, captioned, timed. You forget how much has been filtered out, how much contradiction never appeared. And the more you scroll, the more curated the world becomes, not by ideology, not by conspiracy, but by your own engagement, your likes, your pauses, your shares. You are sculpting the sculpture that shapes you back, a hall of mirrors that learns from each glance, and the longer you live inside it, the harder it is to tell where your reflection ends and the algorithm begins. This is the echo chamber effect, not just hearing your beliefs repeated, but forgetting they're not universal, forgetting they were shaped by exposure, that they were softened by repetition, that they were reinforced by systems that do not ask what will make you wiser, but what will keep you watching. You are not wrong for falling into the loop. You are human. You crave coherence. You lean toward what feels known. The screen doesn't trick you. It offers what you've taught it to offer. And that feedback feels like truth. But truth isn't always popular. Truth doesn't always trend. It doesn't always fit into a caption or win the algorithm's favor. Sometimes truth is quiet, inconvenient, hidden behind headlines that never reach your feed. Sometimes truth isn't in the image you shared. It's in the one that was filtered out, the one that didn't get engagement, the one that wasn't shaped to please. And so the question becomes not what do I believe, but what beliefs have been shown to me again and again until they stopped feeling optional. What have I stopped questioning because it fits too neatly into my digital reflection? What have I never seen because the system decided I wouldn't engage with it long enough for it to matter? You are not passive, you are not helpless, but you are being influenced, constantly, subtly, sculpted not with force but with suggestion. And the shape you take is not random, it is tailored. And tailoring feels like truth when you forget the original fabric, but some part of you remembers. The part that pauses, that wonders, that feels the flicker of contradiction and doesn't swipe past it right away. That discomfort is a gift. It is your mind noticing the frame. It is your awareness brushing up against the edge of the filter. You can still look through the lens, but you can also look at it. You can ask, what am I being shown? What am I not? Whose voices are missing? Whose pain is being made into entertainment? Whose certainty is being amplified, and why? These questions won't dismantle the system, but they will loosen its grip. They will remind you that the screen is not a mirror, it is a tool, and tools must be held carefully, or they begin to hold you. Because belief is fragile when built only from what was easy to find. Because the loudest story is not always the most complete. And because even the sharpest image can be cropped, especially when it fits too perfectly in your pocket. There is a weight to knowing, a soft, invisible heaviness that gathers slowly, quietly underneath everything. Not because the knowledge is painful, but because there is simply too much of it. You are surrounded by information, carried by it, buried beneath it. You wake up to it. You fall asleep beside it. You scroll through pieces of 1,000,000 lives, 1,000 crises, infinite perspectives. And each one arrives with urgency. Each one insists it matters. And perhaps it does. But the mind was not built to hold this many signals, not all at once, not all the time. So the mind adapts, it trims, it filters, it narrows. You stop seeing the complexity, you stop asking questions, you start relying on summaries, signals, shortcuts. Not because you're lazy, because you're overloaded. Because when everything is important, nothing feels real. The flood turns meaning into noise, and in the noise you shrink your awareness just enough to stay upright. You stop trying to understand everything. You start trying to survive the feed. You begin to crave simplicity, the kind that fits on a screen, the kind that speaks in headlines, the kind that doesn't make you feel like you're drowning in contradictions. You reach for certainty, not because it's accurate, but because it's available, because it's easier to believe the world is this or that, good or evil, us or them, than to admit that truth is layered and slow and sometimes never fully known. But nuance doesn't trend. Nuance doesn't go viral. It doesn't spark outrage or reward reaction. So you scroll past it, not because you reject it, but because your bandwidth has limits, and the algorithm has none. This is the paradox. The more you are exposed to, the less deeply you process. You become familiar with everything and intimate with nothing. You know a little about a lot and mistake that for wisdom. But wisdom requires space. It requires time. It requires forgetting some things. Long enough to let others grow roots. You are not a processor. You are a person. And people were meant to pause. But the pause feels risky. To pause is to fall behind. To disconnect is to disappear. So you keep refreshing. You keep consuming. And the more you consume, the more you feel the pressure to have an opinion about everything. Every news cycle, every debate, every disaster. And yet the opinions grow thinner. They become shapes you inherited, reactions you mimicked, because the energy to think deeply has been replaced by the energy to keep up. This is bounded rationality. The truth that even with all the information in the world, you can only hold so much. You make the best decisions you can, given the limits of what you've seen, what you remember, what you can understand in the moment. And yet, you're made to feel as if your ignorance is personal, as if not knowing is a failure, rather than a function of being alive in an age that never stops showing you things. So the mind retreats. It defaults. It uses mental shortcuts not to deceive but to cope. It simplifies. It clings to patterns. It ignores outliers. It prioritizes what is recent, what is vivid, what confirms what you already believe. It's not lying. It's protecting itself. Because a mind that tries to hold everything collapses. A heart that tries to feel everything numbs. A self that tries to understand everything forgets how to be still. And in this forgetting, something is lost, something soft, something necessary. The ability to wonder, the ability to sit with not knowing, the ability to hold a question without rushing toward the nearest answer. You begin to miss the slowness that clarity requires, the patience of building thought instead of borrowing it. You begin to feel how much of what you say is reaction, how little is reflection. And that feeling is uncomfortable. But it's also the beginning of something new. You will not escape the flood. The world is not slowing down. The noise will not stop. But you can learn to hold yourself differently inside it. You can say, I don't know enough to have an opinion yet. You can say, this deserves more than a scroll. You can say, I choose not to simplify this thing just to survive it. And in doing so, You reclaim the space that complexity needs, because knowing everything was never the goal, and pretending you do only makes it harder to know anything at all. Let it be too much. Let some things go unlearned. Let questions remain open. Because wisdom doesn't come from holding more. It comes from knowing what to release. You look in the mirror and see yourself, but what you're seeing is not neutral. It is edited, rehearsed. It is the sum of labels, roles, stories you've been told and learned to tell yourself. This is who I am, you say. This is how I've always been. But identity is not a fact. It is a frame, a loop that tightens every time it is spoken aloud. And the more often it loops, the harder it becomes to see what exists outside of it. You mistake the performance for the person, the mask for the mirror. You forget who you were before you needed to explain yourself. Identity begins as description, a name, a trait, a preference. It helps you belong. It helps you navigate. But over time it hardens. It begins to resist contradiction. It begins to filter what you see. A compliment that doesn't match the script gets ignored. A possibility that doesn't fit the pattern gets rejected. You say, "That's not me," even if it might be, because the version of you you've been defending needs consistency more than it needs truth. This is the glitch, when who you think you are becomes more important than what you might be becoming. It happens slowly. You say, "I'm bad at this" enough times and it becomes a fact. You say, "I don't do vulnerability," and the thought of trying begins to feel like betrayal. You build your life around an outline, and the outline becomes a cage. People expect you to act a certain way, and you deliver. Not because you have to, but because you've forgotten that you could step out of the part. You perform yourself, and the audience claps. And so you stay. But who wrote this role? Was it you? Or was it shaped by what was rewarded, what was punished, what was misunderstood? Did someone tell you early on that you were too much, too quiet, too difficult, too sensitive? Did you start editing yourself to make the room more comfortable? Did you wear the costume long enough that it started to feel like skin? These questions are not accusations. They are doorways. Because even if the identity fits, that doesn't mean it's whole. And even if it feels like you, that doesn't mean it's free. You are not one story. You are not a brand. You are not a fixed set of preferences and reactions. You are an unfolding, a pattern with variations, a memory with edits, a possibility still rearranging itself. But that doesn't sell as easily. That doesn't fit on a profile. So you shave off the messy parts, you curate, you simplify, you pick a label that feels safe, and build a life around defending it. And eventually you begin to fear anything that contradicts the shape you've made. This is the group attribution error, the in-group bias, the need to protect not just your self-image, but the image of the tribe you belong to. You adopt the beliefs that align with the label. You discard the ones that don't. You stop asking what's true and start asking what's consistent. And consistency becomes a virtue, even when it's a lie, even when it's a limitation. But growth is messy. Growth is inconsistent. It makes you contradict yourself. It makes you question what you once defended. It makes you change your mind in public. And in a world obsessed with certainty, that feels like weakness, like betrayal. But it's not. It's alignment, not with the role you've rehearsed, but with the person you're still becoming. A person who is allowed to change, who is allowed to expand, who is allowed to be more than one thing. You are allowed to grieve the version of you you no longer believe in. You are allowed to outgrow your mask. You are allowed to step off the stage, even if the audience is still clapping. Because you were never meant to play one role forever. You were meant to move, to revise, to wake up differently than you were the day before. And if you're scared to let go of who you've been, that's okay. That's part of it. But hold the fear gently. Look at the reflection again, not for the glitch, but for the space beyond it, the blur at the edges, the possibilities hiding behind the certainty. You don't have to name them. You don't have to know what comes next. You only have to know that the mirror is not the whole. You are not the role. You are the actor. You are not the outline. You are the page it was drawn on. And even now, especially now, you can rewrite. By the time you explain your actions, the real reason is already behind you. You don't dig for truth. You smooth over the trail. You tell the story that fits the shape of what you've already done. This is not deception. This is structure. The mind prefers coherence to honesty. It would rather be consistent than correct. And so it builds logic around the decision, like scaffolding around a house already standing. It justifies the feeling. It edits the memory. It rearranges the story. The reasons you give aren't lies, not exactly. They're translations, versions that feel right enough to keep your self-image intact. You cancel the plan and say, I needed rest. But maybe you were afraid. You declined the opportunity and say, it wasn't the right fit. But maybe you didn't believe you were ready. You stay silent in the meeting and say, it wasn't the time. But maybe you thought your voice didn't matter. You tell yourself stories that protect you from discomfort. You call them logic. You call them clarity. But often they are only shields. Thoughtful, polished, invisible shields. This is rationalization, the quiet art of placing meaning after the fact. You feel first, decide second, and reason third. But the order is hidden. By the time the reasons surface, they sound like the origin, like they led the way. But they didn't. They followed. And they're very good at pretending otherwise. The brain does not want to say, I was scared. It wants to say, I was strategic. It does not want to admit, I chose the easier path. It wants to say, I chose the wiser one. And so it folds feeling into language, into logic, into justification, until the true cause is lost under layers of reasoned storytelling. Even when the choice brings pain, the mind rushes to explain. You stay in something that hurts and say, there's still hope. You leave something too soon and say, I had no other choice. You justify the sunk cost. You reinforce the frame. The more investment you've made, time, money, identity, the harder it is to change your mind. You'd rather continue believing the old reason than face the truth that it was never solid. You carry the belief forward, not because it serves you, but because abandoning it would unravel too many threads. Post-purchase rationalization, sunk cost fallacy, motivated reasoning. These aren't just terms in a textbook. They are the quiet patterns running underneath your thoughts every day. The mind, confronted with contradiction, doesn't open. It fortifies. It picks a side and builds a wall of logic around it. A wall made of selective memory, tilted comparisons, redefined standards. It doesn't want to be caught uncertain. It doesn't want to admit that the choice was emotional or impulsive or based on something you no longer believe. So it creates a version of the story where everything makes sense, where everything lines up, even if the truth doesn't live there anymore. But you can begin to hear it, the difference between the reason and the reason you gave. You feel the pause before the explanation arrives, the slight discomfort, the flicker of dissonance. These are not signs of failure. They are signs of truth trying to surface, not to shame you, not to unravel you, but to remind you that your reasons are not fixed. They are flexible, they can change, and you don't have to keep believing something just because you've already said it out loud. You are allowed to rewrite your why. You are allowed to say, I told myself a story that made it easier to stay still. You are allowed to admit that you wanted to be seen a certain way and shaped your logic around that desire. You are allowed to notice when your reasoning is not wrong, but also not real. The realness lives beneath it, in the soft place where the fear first bloomed, where the desire first tugged, where the decision was made long before the reasons arrived. And in that softness, something else can grow, not shame, not correction, but clarity, the kind that doesn't need to be perfect, the kind that lets you hold your past choices with gentleness while still choosing differently next time, the kind that lets you say, that reason made sense then, but I see something else now. You are not dishonest for explaining things the way you did. You were protecting yourself. You were making meaning where you could. But now you know, logic is not always a compass. Sometimes it is a costume. And sometimes, to know what you truly believe, you have to take it off. Not to discard reason, but to find the feeling it was covering, and begin again from there. There is a comfort in being sure, a stillness, a weight that steadies the self. You feel it when you say, I know, even if the knowing is thin, even if the evidence was brief, even if the foundation was built in the dark. Certainty feels solid, and when the world stutters, when questions pile up faster than answers, certainty becomes a kind of gravity. You hold on to it, not because it's earned, but because it's needed, because it silences the inner noise, because it makes decision possible. But certainty is not clarity. It is not wisdom. It is not truth. It is only the absence of doubt, manufactured or inherited, and often it grows fastest where the ground is least stable. The mind likes being right, not because truth matters more than anything else, but because being wrong is costly. It opens doors, it removes anchors, it makes you look back at choices that now need to be re-explained. So the brain builds certainty, even where none exists. It fills gaps with assumption. It chooses one meaning over another, not because it's more accurate, but because it feels better to be decisive than disoriented. The feeling of certainty becomes its own feedback loop. You are sure because you feel sure, and you feel sure because you said it with confidence. And soon, that confidence becomes the evidence. This is the overconfidence effect, the illusion of control, the tendency to trust our answers even when they're guesses, to defend our instincts even when they've failed us. You don't mean to do it. You just forget how often you've been wrong, how many times your obvious intuition wasn't. You remember the wins, the predictions that came true, the moments where your judgment aligned with reality. But the misses blur. The mind doesn't catalog uncertainty with the same reverence. Doubt doesn't get stored as vividly. It fades, and what remains are the bright patches of confidence, arranged into a story that says, I know. I always knew. Certainty becomes identity. You become the person who believes this, who always sees it that way, who doesn't change their mind. And the longer that image lives, the harder it is to disrupt. You stop updating, you stop asking, you resist contradiction, not because it's wrong, but because it threatens the continuity of the self. The story of you has no room for reversal, and so you armor your conclusions even if the world has moved past them, even if you have. But certainty without humility becomes blindness. You stop learning, you stop noticing. You hear new information only as a challenge to be refuted, not an invitation to rethink. And slowly, the mind turns from mirror to wall, reflecting only what's already there, blocking everything else. You feel stable, but it is the stability of a statue, not a living thing. And yet, not all certainty is a lie. Some of it is earned. Some of it is carved through careful attention, through slow questions, through staying long enough with discomfort that the clarity comes on its own. This kind of certainty doesn't shout, it doesn't rush, it doesn't demand allegiance. It is quiet, tentative, willing to be revised. And that's how you know it's real, not because it never changes, but because it holds itself lightly, knowing that more is always coming. The problem is not certainty. The problem is mistaking confidence for knowledge. It's assuming volume means truth. It's confusing repetition with reliability. You begin to say things like, "I'm sure," when you mean, "I'm afraid to be unsure." You begin to speak louder when someone questions you, not because you've checked again, but because silence would make the doubt grow too loud. But doubt is not failure. Doubt is the invitation. It is the soft space where deeper thinking can happen. It is the pause before the reflex. It is the breath before the defense. And it doesn't make you weak. It makes you honest. You are not required to know everything. You are not diminished by saying, "I don't know yet." You are allowed to think in drafts, to hold multiple ideas without collapsing, to let the truth arrive slowly, shaped by time, not fear. So the next time certainty rises, ask, where did this come from? Was it earned or inherited? Is this clarity or just the comfort of not questioning anymore? You might find that the answer isn't wrong. It's just premature. That what felt solid was simply unchallenged. That what you thought you knew was still unfolding. And if you find yourself unsure, you can stay there. You can rest in the soft ground of unknowing. Because not every truth needs to arrive quickly. Some grow slowly. Some ask you to wait. And in the waiting, you may discover that being open is more powerful than being right. Laughter is permission, a small break in the seriousness of things, a place where contradiction can live without confrontation. You tell the joke and the tension breaks. The audience exhales, the subject softens. No one has to say it out loud, but it was said. This is the strange power of humor. It delivers the unspeakable inside something that makes us smile. And in that smile, the idea enters. Not through the gate of critical thought, but through the back door of amusement. You laugh at yourself, at your flaws, at the patterns that trap you. You say, "I'm the kind of person who always ruins things," and you laugh. You say, "Trust issues. I collect them like souvenirs," and you laugh. It's funny because it's exaggerated. It's funny because it's close. But sometimes it's funny because it's true, and too hard to admit without the cushion of comedy. The joke carries the weight so you don't have to. And over time, the laughter repeats, the story repeats, and the repetition builds belief. Not always deliberately, not always consciously, but belief doesn't need your permission. It just needs practice. We use jokes to say things we're not ready to believe openly, to test ideas in a safer container, to turn pain into punchlines so we don't have to feel it too directly. Humor diffuses threat, but it doesn't delete it. The emotion stays folded underneath, and the more you repeat the joke, the more familiar it becomes. Familiarity breeds fluency, fluency breeds comfort, and comfort feels like truth. So the joke becomes a shortcut, not just to connection, but to belief. You begin to believe what you laugh about, not because it's real, but because you've let it in too many times. There's a reason stereotypes survive in comedy, a reason cruelty hides inside irony, a reason entire ideologies can slip into the culture disguised as satire. You hear the same framing again and again, and soon you don't just laugh, you nod. The idea stops sounding strange, it starts sounding obvious. And this is the quiet danger. Humor wears the mask of harmlessness, but not everything that makes you laugh is light. Some things slip under the radar precisely because they're funny, because questioning them feels like ruining the mood. So you laugh again, and the idea grows legs. Even self-directed humor reshapes you. You downplay your ambition, you mock your body, you joke about your failures, you pretend you don't care. You wrap cynicism in wit and call it insight. But the more you tell these stories, the more they settle. You say them faster, you say them better, you say them without thinking. And soon they speak for you. The line between performance and belief dissolves. The audience forgets it's a joke. So do you. But the answer isn't silence. You don't have to stop laughing. You don't have to turn joy into caution. You only have to look underneath. To ask what the joke is protecting. To ask what it repeats. To ask whether the laugh is a release or a disguise. Because humor is a mirror, and some mirrors distort. They flatter the familiar. They sharpen what hurts. They reflect back a version of you that was meant to entertain, not to liberate. Still, there's honesty in laughter. Sometimes it's the only way truth can speak. Sometimes the body knows before the mind does. You laugh not because it's funny, but because it's close. Too close. And that closeness is worth listening to. Not to correct the feeling, but to meet it, to sit beside the part of you that made the joke and say, what are you trying to say, really? What would happen if we said it without hiding behind the punchline? The truth doesn't have to be solemn, it doesn't have to be heavy, but it does deserve space beyond the script, beyond the reflex, beyond the laugh track you've memorized too well. Because somewhere inside the joke, a real sentence is trying to form. One that doesn't need to be clever. One that doesn't need to be safe, only real. And when you hear that sentence clearly, unmasked, unedited, it might still make you smile. But the smile will feel different. Not like escape, like arrival. Fear doesn't wait for evidence. It moves faster than fact. It arrives early, heavy, and uninvited, settling into the body before the mind can name it. A tightening in the chest, a glance over the shoulder, a sentence rehearsed just in case. You begin to act as though something has already gone wrong, even if nothing has happened, not because you're weak, but because fear is persuasive, It doesn't argue, it anticipates, it sketches outlines of what could go wrong and then paints them as likely. And the more vivid the sketch, the more real the danger feels. The mind listens. It starts to shape thought around the fear. The world is filtered through risk. Neutral faces begin to seem suspicious. Delays become signs of rejection. Uncertainty becomes threat. The possibilities narrow, not because reality changed, but because fear did. You become cautious, then guarded, then distant. You protect yourself from a future that hasn't arrived, and in doing so, you bring parts of it closer. You speak with less vulnerability, you hesitate, you brace. And sometimes that bracing changes everything. This is how fear becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. You expect harm, so you act smaller. You expect betrayal, so you trust less. You expect failure, so you prepare for it instead of preparing for possibility. And when the outcome matches the fear, it feels like proof. But maybe it was a loop, maybe the world didn't shrink, maybe you did. The mind doesn't need truth to respond, it only needs a vivid enough image. And fear is skilled at imagery. It borrows memories, it exaggerates patterns, it stitches together moments that were once isolated and calls them fate. A single mistake becomes a prediction. A single loss becomes the shape of everything to come. Fear doesn't ask for permission to repeat itself. It just does, over and over in the background. Not loud enough to stop you, but loud enough to slow you. Loud enough to make joy feel like a risk. Loud enough to make hope feel like something foolish. And yet, fear can be useful. It warns, it protects, it sharpens attention. It keeps you from stepping off the edge. But not all edges are cliffs. Some are thresholds, some are beginnings, some are just unfamiliar, not unsafe. And when fear cannot tell the difference, it treats everything like a fall. You learn to avoid things. Without realizing it, you edit yourself before anyone else has a chance to misunderstand you. You leave before they can leave first. You hold back the thing you most want to say because it feels easier to live with silence than with rejection. This is fear doing its quiet work, not by stopping you, but by reshaping what seems possible. You might say, "I'm just being realistic." But realism often wears fear like a mask. You say, "I'm just protecting myself," and maybe you are. But protection becomes a pattern, and the pattern becomes a world view. And eventually you don't remember what your life looked like before you started building everything around what might hurt. Fear shrinks the room, but awareness widens it. You don't have to banish fear to see clearly. You only have to name it. To say this isn't the truth, it's the version shaped by fear. That recognition doesn't erase the feeling, but it softens its grip. It gives you a window. It gives you a moment to ask, what would I do if I wasn't afraid right now? What would I say if I believed I'd be understood? Where would I go if I didn't already assume the door would be closed? Not all fear is wrong, but not all fear is right. And when you live inside it too long, you begin to mistake its shape for the shape of the world. But the world is wider, softer, stranger. It does not move on fear's schedule. It offers things you weren't expecting. It opens in ways fear said it wouldn't. But only if you stay, only if you speak, only if you let something through that doesn't begin in defense. You are still allowed to be cautious, but caution without curiosity becomes a cage. You are still allowed to pause, but a pause stretched into permanence becomes a silence you forget how to break. Fear is not the enemy. It is a voice, but it is not the only voice. Let it speak, then listen for the one underneath. The one that begins not with danger, but with the question, what if this time it goes differently? Memory has a way of smoothing things over, of pressing its hands into the creases of what was and flattening them until they shine. You don't remember the past as it was. You remember it as it needed to be, cleaner, simpler, framed by feeling more than fact. It isn't dishonesty, it's comfort, a kind of emotional editing. And the longer you look backward, the easier it becomes to believe the best parts were the truest parts, that what came before was purer, more certain, more whole. The present stutters, the future blurs. But the past can be polished until it feels like a truth that time cannot touch. You say, things used to be better. You say, I used to be stronger, happier, clearer. You look at an old photo and see someone you no longer recognize, and a part of you aches, not just for the image, but for the idea of who you were. But memory is selective. It forgets the weight of what you carried. It forgets the fear that came with those moments. It forgets the parts you wanted to escape. Nostalgia doesn't arrive with full context. It arrives in fragments, soft-lit, scored with the music of what's been lost. This is rosy retrospection, the tendency to paint the past in warmer tones than it deserves. It doesn't mean the past was bad, only that it wasn't as simple as your mind wants to believe. Complexity fades with distance, and what remains is the highlight reel, edited for emotional survival. The hard parts become tolerable. The neutral moments disappear. What stays are the bright flashes, the laughter, the ease, the illusion of knowing who you were and what you wanted. But illusions can comfort and still mislead. You carry stories about your past self, what you should have done, what you could have kept, what you'll never have again. But those stories are stitched from memory, not truth, and memory rearranges itself to protect identity. It adapts, it absorbs, it tells the version of events that best supports who you think you are now. And often that means turning the past into a lost paradise, a fixed point you can compare the present against just to feel the ache more clearly. You say, things have changed, and you're right, but not all change is decline. Not all distance is loss. Some of it is growth you haven't had the time or permission to name. And even when the past was good, the mind has a way of making it sacred, untouchable. You believe you'll never feel that way again, that those friendships, those summers, those versions of love were final. But belief built on nostalgia can make the present feel pale by comparison. It sets a bar nothing now can reach, and so the present begins to dim, not because it is lacking, but because it was never given the same framing, the same reverence, the same time. This is the survivorship bias of the self. The memories that endure are the ones that felt best to remember. You survived them. You kept them. But survival is not the same as accuracy. Just because something lasted doesn't mean it was whole. Just because it felt right then doesn't mean it fits now. Still, you hold on. You turn old routines into rituals. You replay the same moments in your mind, not as reference, but as refuge. But the past doesn't need to be a benchmark. It can be a foundation, something to stand on, not kneel before. You are not failing now because it feels harder. You are not broken because the new things haven't settled yet. You are simply living in a chapter without the benefit of hindsight. One day this will also be remembered, and the parts you hated may soften. The chaos may fade, the faces may feel warmer, but that will be later. For now you are still inside it, and inside it you have the choice to give this moment the depth you once gave to those you lost. So when you feel the pull to look back, when that past feels like the only place that ever made sense, pause. Ask, what am I not seeing about now? What am I glorifying in what was? What part of me is still trying to go home to a place I've already outgrown? The past may feel perfect, but that perfection is not a memory. It's a mirror, reflecting what you miss, what you fear, what you once held without knowing how rare it was. But now, you know, and with that knowing you can begin again, not to recreate what was, but to recognize what is still possible, even here, even now. Silence is not empty. It holds shape. It forms meaning. Sometimes more meaning than the words we manage to say. You walk through a room, through a conversation, through a memory, and it's not just what was spoken that you remember. It's what was avoided. The glance held too long, the reply that never came, the question that was almost asked, the apology that hovered but never landed. You fill in the gaps with instinct, then with fear, then with certainty. And over time, what wasn't said becomes louder than whatever was. The mind does not like ambiguity. It seeks resolution. It turns unfinished stories into closed books. You weren't given the answer, so you wrote one yourself. You weren't told the truth, so you created a version that made sense, and that version stayed. It grew roots, because even an invented ending feels better than no ending at all. This is the illusion of closure. We'd rather believe something hurtful than admit we simply don't know. And so silence becomes a sculptor. It shapes your memories in shadow. The things left unsaid in childhood become the things you believe about yourself now. The things your friends didn't mention become questions you carry into every new connection. The things your parents couldn't name became the rules you live by. Don't be too much. Don't ask for clarity. Don't expect tenderness to stay. These rules were never printed. They were inferred. And inference can be more lasting than instruction, because when the truth is unclear, the mind guesses, and once it guesses, it doesn't like to guess again. This is the power of omission. It doesn't confront. It suggests. It allows belief to grow in the dark without correction. You hear what they didn't say and assume it means what you feared. You share something vulnerable and hear only the pause that followed. You replay it not because of what was said, but because of what wasn't. The human mind treats gaps like invitations, and fear is often the first guest to arrive. And silence isn't just out there. It's inside, too. There are things you haven't said, things you've swallowed, rehearsed, buried, beliefs you never formed on purpose, but formed anyway because the room didn't allow for more. And now those beliefs move through you like facts. You say, I'm just quiet, but maybe you were interrupted too often. You say, I don't need reassurance, but maybe you just learned it wouldn't come. You say, this is just how I am, but maybe that silence became armor, and the armor became identity. And even now, in the present, silence keeps shaping what's possible. A truth you don't speak becomes a distance. A need you don't name becomes a misunderstanding. A boundary unspoken becomes a wound. And often the other person doesn't even know, because silence hides itself as mercy, as strength, as peace. But it is not always those things. Sometimes silence is confusion. Sometimes silence is fear wearing the mask of calm. Sometimes silence is the loudest thing in the room. Still, silence is not the enemy. It is a space, and space can be filled with choice. You can fill it with presence, with curiosity, with questions asked gently enough to bring the unsaid into light. Not everything needs to be spoken, but some things do. Some things, if held too long in silence, begin to harden. They become belief, they become distance, they become truth by default. So ask, what haven't I said because I assumed it wouldn't matter? What have I accepted as true, not because it was proven, but because no one said otherwise? What belief lives in me that was never spoken into existence, but bloomed in silence anyway? Because what's unspoken still speaks. It shapes, it lingers, it leaves traces. But you can answer it now. Not with perfect words, not with certainty, just with willingness to name what was left unnamed, to listen beneath the quiet, to say finally, this mattered, even if no one said it, it mattered, and now it can be heard. You wake each day and walk a path you don't always remember choosing. The words you use, the thoughts that arrive, the way your body moves through a conversation. It all feels natural, automatic, like this is just who you are. But often it's not who you are, it's what you've rehearsed. And what you've rehearsed begins to feel inevitable. A script learned long ago, recited not because it's right, but because it's memorized. You repeat it, not aloud, but through rhythm, through patterns, through choices that feel like instincts but are actually echoes. The mind likes loops. They are efficient. They are predictable. They conserve energy. When you've thought something enough times, it becomes easier to think it again. When you've done something enough times, it becomes harder to imagine doing anything else. Repetition becomes truth. Not because it's true, but because it's present, and presence feels like reality. This is the spiral. A thought repeated so often it begins to carve a path, and the path becomes identity. You no longer ask if it's right. You ask why it still hurts, even though it feels so familiar. A loop can look like a line if you never zoom out. You think you're moving forward, but you're circling. You think you're evolving, but you're orbiting the same fear, the same doubt, the same version of yourself you've been trying to outgrow. You change the setting, the relationship, the goal, but the internal rhythm remains. You feel stuck, not because you haven't moved, but because you haven't moved differently. This is repetition priming. This is the familiarity bias. This is habit dressed as truth. A belief you've never questioned becomes a decision made 1,000 times without pause. You say this always happens, and eventually it does, not because it was destined, but because you met it halfway. You stepped into the story again, not because you wanted to, but because it was there. And when something is always there, it becomes invisible. You think, why can't I change? But change doesn't come from wanting a different outcome. It comes from disrupting the loop, from breaking the rhythm, from noticing the moment you usually go left and going right instead, not out of rebellion, but out of awareness. That awareness is small. It's not a revolution. It's a pause, a single breath where the loop stutters, a single moment where you feel the script trying to continue and you do not follow it. But loops resist being broken. They offer safety. They offer identity. You've been this way for so long. Who would you be if you weren't? You fear the unfamiliar more than the pain you know. You say, "This is just who I am," because it feels easier than saying, "This is who I've been rehearsing." But identity is not a destination. It's a process. It's always under revision, unless you decide it's not. The spiral grows when you stop asking questions, when you stop interrupting the default, when you confuse frequency for fact. But you can feel the loop if you listen closely, the sense of déjà vu not from memory but from habit, the argument you've had again, the doubt that arrives with the same voice wearing the same mask. You recognize it, but still give it your attention, still trace the same arc back to the same conclusion. But you can step outside. You don't have to run from the spiral. You only have to look at it, trace its shape, see where it repeats, and name the places where you gave in without knowing you had a choice. Ask yourself, what am I still repeating that no longer fits? What belief have I kept because it feels easier to carry than to put down? What moment am I reliving under a different name? The spiral cannot be destroyed. It can only be seen, and once seen, it loosens. Slowly, quietly, it gives you space to write something else. Not a loop, not a reaction, but a direction. One not built from what was repeated, but from what was chosen. You will still return sometimes. The path is well worn. But now you'll recognize it. You'll feel the curve. And maybe just once, you'll pause. And in that pause, you'll take a step. Not forward, but away. There comes a point when you begin to see it, the quiet architecture of everything you once believed to be solid. You see the scaffolding beneath your thoughts, the fingerprints on the glass of your opinions, the framework shaping every choice you thought you made freely. You begin to see how your memories are stitched from feeling, how your beliefs are carved from repetition, how your identity is more echo than origin. You don't panic, you don't collapse, you just see it. And the seeing changes everything. You don't stop believing, you stop believing automatically. You feel the space between the thought and the truth. You hear the hesitation in your own certainty. You begin to ask, not out of rebellion, but out of reverence. What is this idea protecting? What does this pattern prevent? What do I gain by keeping this belief alive? The world doesn't simplify when you wake up. It grows stranger, softer, wider. The edges blur, the answers multiply. But within the blurring, something honest begins to glow. You start to notice the illusions. Not the grand ones, the systems, the screens, the stories we inherit, but the small ones, the ones that whisper, "You're not enough," the ones that say, "They won't love you if you change," the ones that keep you inside a self you've outgrown. You begin to see how many of your fears were shaped to match your expectations, how many of your truths were conveniences, how often you mistook control for safety, clarity for wisdom, familiarity for reality. And still, the illusion doesn't break. It doesn't vanish in some burst of awakening. It stays. But now you see through it. You see how your thoughts arrive with a voice that isn't always your own, how your preferences were nudged, not chosen, how your memories lean toward emotion more than fact. You begin to understand. Awareness is not a place you reach. It's a way of seeing again and again without falling asleep to what you've already seen. Being awake in the illusion means learning to live among distortions without mistaking them for truth. It means holding beliefs loosely, identities gently, desires curiously. It means accepting that perception is always bent, that clarity is not permanent, and that certainty is often the enemy of growth. You become less attached to being right, more committed to being honest. You begin to care less about whether the story feels good and more about whether it's still alive. This doesn't make life easier. In some ways, it makes it heavier. There's no longer a script to hide behind, no longer a single lens to explain it all. But there's freedom in that. Not the freedom of control, but the freedom of movement, of revision, of beginning again. You can feel the illusion pressing in through culture, through memory, through fear, and still say, I see you, but you are not all there is. You are not just a product of what's been said to you, or what's been done to you, or what you've been taught to believe. You are the one who can pause, the one who can ask, the one who can choose to notice what is true right now, even if it contradicts what was true yesterday. Especially then, there is no clean exit from the illusion. There is no final clarity. There is only the practice of waking up inside it. Again and again and again. You can still play the role, still wear the mask, still speak the language of the dream. But now, behind your eyes, something is watching. Something is listening. Something knows. You are not lost. You are not broken. You are not the illusion. You are the one who noticed. And noticing, you begin.